Okay, hello everyone. I'm Catherine West, lecturer in ceramics at GMIT, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you today our speaker, Jonathan Keep, in our fourth webinar in our Applied Arts Ireland, Applied Arts Northern Ireland webinar series. At this point, I'd like to thank the Design and Crafts Council of Ireland for their generous funding of this webinar series. And I'd also like to thank Owen Quinlan and Shane Porter, who have been very instrumental in setting up the webinar series, which has been a great asset in these difficult times for both students and lecturers and anyone working in ceramics today. So I'd like to introduce Jonathan, artist, renowned international artist, and also pioneer in 3D printing. And I think I'll just hand over to Jonathan now, and then he'll talk for approximately 45 minutes. And then at the end, we'll have a little bit of time for questions. And you can write your questions to me in the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom panel. And I'll be able to take those questions if there's time at the end, okay, of the session. So over to you, Jonathan. Thank you very much.
Right, thanks, Catherine, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about my work. And obviously, thank you for those who are spending their lunchtime watching this or catching up on it later on. I gather although it's been streamed on Facebook, it'll then also be on Facebook, for a period to be caught up on afterwards. Anyway, so I've got a range of slides here that I'll go through talking about my work. And the first slide is sort of answering that question that I'm often asked, and that is, where do you live? So I'm about 100 miles north of London, the red spot here. So for about the last 10 years, I've been working, most of my work, and certainly now all my work is done in 3D printing. So I was in from the early days of it. And the other markers on the map here are places that I've either done workshops on, well, workshops at, or done lectures or residencies, or anyway, projects with and then there've been a number of projects out in America and well, an exhibition out in China as well. So anyway, it's illustrating just the interest there is in ceramic 3D printing. Although, as you can see by the number of spots, I'm very happy to talk about 3D printing. I have taken this opportunity to talk a little bit more about the ideas behind my work. So the next slide here, I guess, is kind of an introduction. I just like the idea that if you see somebody's working environment, it tells you a lot about the way they work and kind of, where they're coming from. So my work is, particularly I'm interested in form, and that's, sort of how we relate to form in a very kind of physical way. When I started out with the 3D printing, we were converting plastic machines to work in clay. So I then developed this machine, that I built myself and put it out as an open source sort of project. So this is available online to be able to build. And then I've developed that into other machines, top and bottom down here. But then sort of over the years, I've also become friends with a company in Italy called Wasp. And so they give me machines to test and to feedback. And so, top right on this are Wasp machines. Once the clay is actually printed out, or, I prefer to call it sort of computer guided coil building, because it literally is, that old traditional coil building. The clay is then dried and then fired in a similar way. So, my studio with gas kiln and electric kiln, that was set up for traditional ways of working is still appropriate for this way of working. And then I need to sort of add to that obviously I studied pottery at school, so I've been working in clay for nearly 50 years. And it's that tacit knowledge of the material and the processes, you know, throwing, coiling, that has all fed into being able to actually kind of develop the 3D printing. So, you know, a range of clay tests to see which clay works best and so on and so forth. And then the top left image here is actually the way that I make my forms, and that is generating them out of code. So this next slide is a bit more sort of kind of why, whereas the last one was what I do. This is a bit more why I do it, I guess. And that was, I was born out in South Africa, and my father was working for a game preservation group, and at the time something Save the White Rhino. So this is actually myself about age 8. And this experience kind of growing up in a game reserve was absolutely, you know, sort of central to my worldview, my development. So, you know, Darwinism, those natural processes that have come out of that, ecology, all that absolutely makes sense for me. You know, sort of the balance between, you know, animals within the game reserve, the ecological balance that there is just, you know, made sense. And then the diversity of the animals also made sense. So although, you know, that's kind of a very science type background, my interests in art were always there. So this sort of central image here is in some ways representing what is termed by the biology of beauty, and that is that link between aesthetics and then our inherited sort of biology that has evolved out of the same system that all the other animals have evolved out of. Bottom left here, I guess, is trying to, you know, sort of just illustrate or remind myself to talk about it. It's that kind of crossovers between art and science that's of interest, and that is artists and scientists, I think, ultimately are trying to do the same thing, and that's explain, you know, give explanation for the world that we live in. Obviously, scientists do it in a very analytical way, where artists do it in a much more kind of intuitive way. Then the image in the middle here, a piece of Bach written music, is illustrating that sort of, you know, what becomes important, you'll see in my work, and that is between a kind of objective realism and then the subjective interpretation of that. So here you have a music score, call it a code of music, that is then transferred through a machine, through a piano, through an instrument, and then we receive it as an audience. And what's going on between this kind of objective piece of code or you know, output, and then the subjective emotions that we get from these, you know, from this code. And then the final image here is a Jackson Pollock image, and that is, you know, just talking about the idea of randomness or chance, and the importance that I think chance plays in our lives. So these are sort of images that have always intrigued me. The reading of it is coming down in each case. So, you know, a morphology of embryo, obviously all starting from an egg, from a very simple natural sort of process, but over time, each will grow into, you know, a different form. So this is trying to explain, you know, my interest in using code to generate my forms is that in some ways, I work really back at the egg level. I mean, my coding is very, very basic, but how, you know, from just a simple couple of lines of code, you can start to generate forms that differ each time you change the parameters of the code. Another image, I think this is trying to illustrate this idea of kind of the biology of beauty, and that is that, you know, the beauty that, these are soap bubbles. So it's the curve on a soap bubble. Obviously, a soap bubble that's flowing, is floating free, is you know, a round sphere. And the beauty that we find in these objects, the gloss on the surface, you know, what is it about these objects that, you know, why is it that we're really drawn to them? You know, it's for me, it's because we have actually grown out the same system that the soap bubbles have. So this slide is, the other kind of formative influence on my early life, and that was growing up in Zululand in South Africa. These are photographs that I would have taken in about the 70s, I should think. 70s, probably early 80s. I was then did a fine art, sort of school, and then a fine art degree, specializing in ceramics, in what was then apartheid South Africa, in a white university, and our education was kind of European fine arts. But then looking at this indigenous culture that was alongside the white culture because of the apartheid system in South Africa, what I was studying, in the European sort of canon of art, it did not make sense for interpreting this kind of artwork. I mean, the European Western way of art would call all of this work craft. With the result is you then left saying, well, what is fine art to this culture? And one, sort of, you understand that these are cultural constructs, actually, the definitions of art. In the embarrassment of my kind of white upbringing out there, I certainly decided I didn't want to kind of get caught up in the fine art world of, European fine art. And I made a decision that I would be a potter. I had, as I said, started potting at school, so I was comfortable with that. But it was objects like this that kind of really helped inform those early years. So these are carved milking pails. Brancusi, the Romanian sculptor, would be, I should think, very taken by these objects. And this here is a beaded skirt. I would, sort of now working digitally a lot of the time, I'm always intrigued how you can start to analyze this as actually a digital pattern where each little bead becomes almost a pixel and it's built up. As with the baskets as well, each stitch is built up. So it's, sort of the point I'm trying to make there is that although they are different systems, there is a commonality in their sort of aesthetic of the way that the patterns are made and built up. So this, is a slide that I've made up recently, but it refers back to that sort of those concerns I had 40 years ago of kind of, what is a creative activity, what is art form, crossed with that Darwinian sort of world opinion that I had, or what you want to call it, sorry, is in the last 40 years has been a really, in my view anyway, interesting development within, sort of the I suppose, philosophy and of art, and that is to take a much more multidisciplinary view to it, rather than just art historians, who have been educated in a Western art school, theorizing about, what is good art and what is bad art. Here we've got anthropologists, and then particularly evolutionary anthropologists, and then a particular interest of mine is evolutionary psychologists, who are looking at aesthetics and looking at art and saying, as in the slide, this is, rock art from across the world. Going back, 50,000 years before present, it's very difficult to try and date these works. But what you can take away from it is obviously, this creativity is across the globe, that, current anthropologists, scientists are saying that obviously modern man probably evolved out of Africa and then moved through Europe and Asia, getting to Australia about 50,000 years ago. That's a little while. I put this date up here. And then the expansion probably, across into North America and then down into South America. But the point being that art has been carried with this movement the whole time. In other words, that, you know, if you go back to Darwinian ideas of natural selection and selecting for fitness, then the idea of art has been carried around the world. I've then tried to personalize this a little bit to myself, and so, you know, right from when I first studied, and then I further did a master's, I moved to the UK in 1986, and then I did a master's degree in about 1999 into 2000 down at Royal College of Art. And over this period, I've been sort of toying with this what I call the language of pots. And that is, you know, back in those days in South Africa, as I say, I decided to be a potter, but I also wanted to be a sculptor. So, you know, from there, I've always treated my pots. I've also made domestic ware pots, you know, sort of mugs and bowls, such as a business, but the sculptural pots, I've always wanted to sort of make outside of the marketplace, and treat the other pots as pieces of, you know, communication of expression, my expression, communication to an audience. So referencing back to kind of the history of pots has given me the confidence that, you know, there are those pots out there that, you know, are sculptural in nature. And so in this panel here, I've got a group of African pots here, Middle Eastern pots, piece coming out of Turkey, North American pots, Chinese pots, funerary urns, South American pots, very early Japanese pots, South American Fijian pots, and then very early European pots. And you know, interesting that these European pots, probably about, you know, 10,000 years before present, of much the same era as this Japanese Jarman pot as well. Most of this work, actually, except for the Chinese, is probably also pre-pottery wheel. And I think something, you know, sort of quite significant has happened with the development of, you know, sort of the pottery wheel and more machinery. Anyway, so going here a little bit onto what I do. You know, firstly, I think I need to say that I feel very strongly that any creative activity should be a reflection of the time in which it's done. So I have no problem actually using digital coding. You know, we live in a digital age to actually produce the form of my pots, and then use, you know, the technology, 3D printing to print them out. So here we can see, you know, the code actually gives me a visualization, a virtual sort of mesh of what the object might look like. There is a little bit more code that this goes, or another piece of software that this goes through and then gets outputted as the actual object. And it's this transformation from sort of abstract or almost mathematics through to physical object that can be held and sort of touched, that, you know, kind of it's of real interest. So in, you know, a group like this, the Iceberg series, as I say, the forms have been generated in code and then printed out. So my sort of subject matter here is, you know, sort of taking the iceberg as an representation of, or sort of icon's a bit of a strong word, but of environmental concerns, an image of environmental concerns. And I like the idea of actually taking it as a vessel form, the idea that actually the environment is this container in which we all live. So you can see when I talk about pots, I'm not talking about necessarily utilitarian pots. It's actually more the kind of the sculptural idea of what a pot might be, you know, the metaphoric ideas that a container can carry with it. So here I'm talking about environment, and then the process I use, the material, I'd like wherever possible to try and use this to reinforce the content of, the expression I'm trying to put across. So here I know that the machine works in this very horizontal manner, laying down the coils. So you get the sort of the layering, the striation that is, the way that ice gets laid down. And then my choice of porcelain to work in these is, using the analogy of the translucency of the porcelain and the ice. So my material is significant, I hope, to sort of representation of the work. And then the forming technique that I've used is, say, the coding. It uses something, a mathematical function called Perlin noise. But Perlin noise is a form of randomness, but it's not totally random. If I used a totally random piece of code here, I just get lots of spikes. Whereas the Perlin noise, and here it's not noise as in sort of musical sound, it's noise as in outer space. They talk about all the speckle and the randomness out in outer space, apparently noise, random noise. It's that sort of noise we're talking about here. But as the sort of algorithm runs, it knows what randomness has just gone before it. So it's not, sort of totally random. It's just random to a little bit to what the randomness has come before it. And that then distorts these forms and is what gives the form, these objects, their surface and their texture. And then that is what intrigues me, is that how, here we have kind of mathematical interpretation of how ice actually melts, how soil erodes. You're starting to get an explanation or an understanding of the natural world through science, through mathematics. So, the result is that I'm using the process of 3D printing, the material, the translucent clay, and then my forming technique, the coding, to all come together into the content of the work. Random growth series. I tend to work in series because I sort of get an idea that is often based around a piece of code, and then I can generate a lot of work out of that. So this random growth series has been running since 2012. You'll see that the dates progress as it goes along. And the essence of these pieces is to code in virtual space, well, define a space in an area in virtual space, sorry, introduce a sphere and allow that sphere to then just randomly move around in that space. If it gets to the edge of what I've defined as the space, it then returns back to the middle. So anyway, the point I'm really trying to make here is that, a bit like kind of clouds or bits of driftwood or something like that, I'm generating as such, ready-made forms or found objects, and then present them in a way that I hope that the viewer starts to respond to it. And it's this point of, having quite an objective way of starting the work, but then seeing how subjectively we respond to that. Myself as the maker, I choose which ones I actually want to present, and then offer them up to the viewer to interpret them. So, my point is that if you are seeing figures in these pieces, it's because us human beings want to make sense of the world in our own image, inevitably. Any gods that we might have tend to be in our own image or within, sort of what we know, because that's our, imaginative spectrum. So you as a viewer coming to these pieces are putting your own ideas, thoughts, imagination into these pieces. And, for me, that's really important in that I'm wanting to, and I think this is a problem that a lot of people have with my work, and that is so they want to say, well, oh, you're using a lot of technology, where's the humanity in it? And I'm saying, well, the humanity is actually in the viewer. is that I want to try and take the kind of artist ego out of the work and find that dialogue between what interests me and what interests the viewer. So it's a much narrower sort of expression, but I hope much richer for that. So these obviously, these random growth forms drawing in the studio, and then the pieces once glazed and finished on exhibition. Now, you know, added here is that this piece here is allowed to grow just randomly, where the other three pieces, I've actually introduced a bit of symmetry as well. So it's you know, playing with areas of kind of human aesthetics. Now, symmetry is you know, all of this stuff. There's you know, masses of scientific research that you know is being done and is of intrigue. But the importance of, you know, and so the speculation is the importance of symmetry in the you know, our personal psychological development. You know, that when choosing mates, you'll be probably looking at symmetry as to for well-being of individuals and so on and so forth. So anyway, I think, you know, what I'm trying to say is here is that we have well, I mean, I think it's well known that we have an eye for pattern recognition, and symmetry within pattern recognition is something that kind of we pick up on. In the background here is a drawing that is you know, a digitally generated drawing. So I'm drawing as well as making 3D objects. That is using these same ideas of sort of random, you know, sort of random generation, but then it is mirrored left and right to get that symmetrical sort of pattern. Seabed, this is a work that I generated again out of one piece of code using something called spherical harmonics, but in a way that that algorithm has got about 8 different parameters to it. So I can just slowly move the parameters. So where, you know, my thinking here is I start with a very simple form, and then I can actually generate this sort of morphology or evolve a series of forms going across, and then at the same time evolve it coming down. And then inevitably you get the complexity of the evolution of, you know, sort of the across and the down coming down into the right-hand corner. So at one level, yes, you can say, oh, this is just, you know, an objective, rather mechanical playing with forms. And then I can say, yeah, but at the same time, if you start to personalize this, you can start to think about it in your own sort of life, that you can start as this simple person, and these can be, you know, a development of your life experience into, you know, going in all directions. So it's not surprising we become these complex beings in later in life. You can, you know, take this as a visualization of how ideas might expand as well. You know, you'll get an idea developing in that direction, and you'll get a development in this direction. And then the cross-fertilization of that development can become something much, much more complex. So I think continually you'll see in all my work, there is this sort of development or interest in going from something that is quite simple into some, you know, and then getting to a complex. So the same piece, I do, you know, well, I'd like to put the slide in that it's, in this case, I was invited to a digital arts festival to exhibit these pieces. And I think this has been, you know, for myself, one refreshing outcome of the way I work, and that is that I've managed to sort of break out of what I call the ghetto of the ceramic world, that you know, ceramics tends to get shown in ceramic galleries and in ceramic festivals and in ceramic this, that, and the other. But because of, you know, using the digital techniques, it's sort of, I won't say released me from that. I'm still a ceramic artist, I guess, a part of that. But it has, you know, given me other opportunities. Another one of these sort of series or morphologies of work And in this one, I've been concentrating just on the curve. So taking something very simple and saying, okay, there's a straight line, but if the world was only made of straight lines, one wouldn't be very interesting, and that everything would be square. But then as you sort of go further into that, is the realization of how we respond to curves. I think it, and I was just the other day, I saw a PhD paper that was based on the research of human and primates' preference for curved objects and spherical objects. So, again, I set up something that's quite formal, but when you start researching it, you find that those patterns are, actually deeply embedded in our environment and in our evolution, and then the systems and processes that control our world and our lives. So I think it's difficult to say, oh, well, I'm removing these pieces, because inevitably you are part of them, because you are part of the system, the mathematics that has generated it all. So this piece that I call ecosystem, I very consciously sort of composed it or laid it out with this sort of backbone to it. So it's got this sort of almost skeletal or sort of nervous system layout, a branching system to it. So, there's a development of the forms in one direction, and then they slowly come out and develop out from there. And so that, the reference to ecosystem, again, I can't say it's explicit content. I mean, very not, the way I work is more to have ideas and to say, well, as I've expressed earlier, is to give the space for the viewer to actually interpret it. But I guess it's obviously a detail of the same piece, but my interpretation here is that we tend to think of ecological balance as being something out there in the environment, out in nature, and so on and so forth. But my assumption being that obviously if we are part of nature, we are part of that same system, then there is ecology in our own lives. And it's this ecology of our own lives that really intrigues me, and how we tend to compartmentalize our lives, put different bits into different containers. And then what's the relationship between these containers? These might be sort of friendships and friendship groups, and the way friendship groups work, and group dynamics. And so actually what happens if within a friendship group, someone leaves the group, as in nature, if a tree falls down, then, sort of the environment around it changes, and the same happens with us. And I think this, it just sort of offers you a way to negotiate your own life, referencing to these natural patterns and systems. So the Harmonic Vowels series, it's a series I actually haven't shown. I think I've possibly shown it once, but it's a series I really like. My intrigue here is actually sort of how Brancusi-esque these are. I mean, I referenced Brancusi earlier on. He's a sculptor who I've always very, very admired. I guess, what the intrigue here is that Brancusi was particularly interested in folk art, sort of art of produced in a non-academic manner, not by people who've been to art school. And so it was there, the claim is that it's much more intuitive kind of art. And I think I've had this, put to me very often, sort of, where's the intuition in your work if you're, working in such a technical way? And I say, well, but that's the very point of it, is that, I hope it comes out in these pieces that Brancusi and myself are interested in that intuition. And now what is, the derivation of the word intuition? It's out of instincts, instinct in animals, instinct in human beings. they did all, reference, sorry, I go on about it, but referencing back to those patterns. So these pieces, again, have got a lot of parameters to them, and I can change the parameters, and I'm working in a very simplistic manner in comparison to the way kind of instinct works and how natural interaction works and how the brain works and everything else. But going back to that sort of simplicity, complexity thing, I'm thinking in some ways, if we can get back to the simplicity of things and understand the simplicity, you can then build into the complexity. So pieces like this, that referencing back to the language of pots, I think that the opening of a pot is at one level that formal, it's the rim, it's the line that makes the rim, but that offers an expression in itself, is how we relate to the curves. I've spoken about the curves earlier. And then within a pot form or vessel form is the inside and the outside, and the intrigue of the volume of the inside. I think we kind of psychologically are drawn inside as much as to the outside. So scale is another thing. So here I'm taking the same code, and I can generate a lot of forms out of that, and then actually by scaling within the software, I can change and coil build, or sort of print large or small. But what's happening there, that's in a very objective way, but in a much more subjective manner as a viewer, and that is, how do you relate to these pieces? Are they small and intimate that draw you into them and you hold them in your hand? Or are they much bigger that stand in the room and you sort of are confronted by them? That it's your bodily relationship, that sense of scale, that an ant will have a different sense of scale to a human being. And so scale is, again, something very physical. This intrigue of pots is obviously the figurative quality that they have, that they stand there like we do. We tend to think of, the feet, the belly, the shoulder of pots. And then using that sort of language of pots, you can then, build expression, through that and around that. So here I'm piling them. And the actual, I'm not necessarily trying to make any one big artistic statement with them. As is, I've been alluding the whole time, I'm leaving it up to the viewer to actually complete the work and bring their own ideas to it. Another group of work, the Ants series. I was fortunately invited by the curator Wendy Gers to participate in this exhibition in China, and so being invited. Early on, there was discussion as to kind of what my subject matter might be, and I took on the idea of ants, these communal beings. I mean, they're insects, not animals, but it's animal insects. So you can set up a conversation with your viewer, through analogy, I suppose it is English. So I'd already been working on the digital drawings, or what I call my bug drawings, that are involved in symmetries and mirroring. So within the display, there was printed out drawings, but also an animation. So working in code, I can have these digital animations running. And then there were two other groups of work, Langton Ants and then the Ant Hills. So the Langton Ants were printed porcelain pieces, but actually they would make really nice jelly molds. But anyway, the essence of these I was researching up, around the idea of ants, and found these things that were called Langton Ants. And ultimately, they have nothing really to do with ants, except Miss Langton, who's a scientist, mathematician, theoretician on chance, area of interest of mine, and probability, sets up these thought experiments on basically a checkered board, and you have the ants, and the ant then is animated in such a way that it moves forward onto the next cube. And if it's a black cube, it turns 90 degrees to the right. If it's a white cube, it turns the other way. And then it moves onto that cube. That cube changes color, and it is left to run. His project is, this turning machine is set in 2 dimensions, and out of it, it's the point of probability out of seeing what will actually emergent properties out of this, is that it runs randomly in certain circumstances for some time, and then finally actually gets locked into a loop, and this kind of looping branch would then just carry on and on and on. Anyway, it's these things that I'm intrigued by, and what I wanted to do was, rather than in 2-dimensional, I wanted to push it up into 3 dimensions. So each time the ant went back over a cube, the cube would get higher. So it's sort of one of those things of chance, that the Langton's ant actually makes anthills. So then the anthills themselves, the colored clay is the actual clay that, the color of the clay that I used. I loaded the 3D printer with different colored clays, and then as its coil builds or extrudes the clay out, it would you'd get this change in color anyway as it builds up. On these pieces, I've used the Perler noise again, but sort of the area of interest here is the point being that a community of ants have the ability to build an anthill, and the point of the anthill is to actually keep the very heart of the anthill down the bottom, where the queen ant is and where their food is, at a constant temperature, so that the whole structure, the piece of architecture, actually has an inbuilt through draft of air to keep it cool. And the question is how there is no one single designer. The ants just have an algorithm or an instinct in them to know what they have to do, and the resultant piece of architecture works. And there's all sorts of theories. I haven't got time to go into that now. Really intriguing theories as to kind of how this happens. But the point is that here you have what is an emergent property, that as long as everyone does their job, then it comes out how you expect it to, how it has been evolved to come out over a period of time. Fraction series, I've been lucky enough to be involved in projects, firstly in Sweden, looking at digital techniques, and in a glass studio and ceramic studio, and then again teaching down in Limoges in France. Part of that class, we went to glass studios in Meisenthal over in the east of France. Anyway, this gave me the opportunity to, build this group of work. And here I am being, I guess, the potter that I am, and it's thinking through the idea of a glaze coating, this sort of skin that sits over the body of the pot, and the body of the pot is often the clay. So I've got a porcelain body inside, and then the glaze on the outside, and I've purposefully made enough space in between such that light can then go through the glass and then refracts and actually patterns the glass underneath. So actually, the pattern of the surface of these pots is coming from the light quality. So it's a little how they made it. I can then 3D print a shape that becomes a waste mold for the glass blowers. So the shape is printed, and then it's biscuit fired, and glass is blown into it, and then that can control the shape of the glass, and then I will print the second shape to go on the inside later on. So a group series of them, and you can see that as the light changes, the pattern on the pieces will change with it. So there's a kind of an animation and time element to them as well. Random cube series, these are quite recent, you can see by the date. In some ways, you know, again, one of these very kind of formal experiments on my part is to then see what I can get out of it, so that the, you know, the initial cube is generated, and then in the drawing program, I use a program called Blender. I will then, you know, redraw these pieces into shapes that intrigues me, and experiment with them. I think, I guess this is, you know, one of the pieces that the content is most explicit about, rather than, you know, the content being much more implicit about the actual sort of particular elements here. There's a bit more of an idea, a structure to this that I can show you here. So the title of the piece, I think, has been taken out of Darwin's notebook, from the page of his initial sort of branching diagram, the idea that species have actually evolved in this branching form. So sort of from number one here, growing out. I've then taken that idea to try and talk about my interest, that is ceramics and pots, and this idea how, you know, we have at a cultural level pots that have then stylistically developed throughout the world, and the commonality that there is between, you know, pots as an artistic medium, but then also the commonality between the people that have actually made them. So in this map, it's a sort of an indication of actually skin color as well. So in this image, you can see how I've then, you know, upscaled the branching tree diagram, and then I've placed my objects actually, you know, on that evolving tree, I guess. So over here, you can see my initial pot. Now, I haven't tried to sort of replicate you know, world's ceramic heritage. I mean, you know, that's massive. I'm not going anywhere close to that. But all I'm trying to do is to talk about the commonality, one of, you know, sort of culture, and the commonality of race as well. So, you know, my first piece is a simple beaker shape over here, made in black clay, and then the shapes slowly evolve as they travel out, and then the surface evolves as well as we go, you know, down the evolving lines. And not uncommonly with my work, you know, and important for the content of the work, the whole piece is then generated out of one piece of code, so a bit like a DNA code. You know, all of these shapes have come from the one origin. Fractal series, I'm getting towards the end here. Fractals have become kind of really, or I would not say obsessive, but I can become obsessive about things. And that is, you know, sort of the maths that I did at school was Euclidean maths, but over the last 40 years, fractal maths has really come to the fore, and a little out of, you know, the interest in, well, the ability of computers to compute to such an extent. And fractal maths offers a much better representation of the natural world, a much better, you know, understanding of kind of the complexity of the world, and also in some ways the chaos of the world. You know, Euclidean maths can't explain a cloud or the landscape mountains, whereas fractal maths does so much better. This was at a residency in Austria, and I did want to say here, obviously, I've spoken a lot about my work rather than, you know, talking particularly about the actual techniques I'm using. You know, I am very happy to talk about the technique. And on my website, I have published a lot of information about technique. There's, you know, sort of a guide to 3D printing if you're interested. So more of the fractal series, based around sort of routing forms. These will actually be generated, from the bigger part, slowly going through to the smaller part. But then having generated them one way, I'll flip them and go the other way. This setup here, I think, really kind of satisfying in that these pieces, 2017, but there's probably 15 years between the ceramic pieces in the foreground and the drawings at the background. So there's a continual growth of interest in sort of these areas. Again, the branching idea, these are just flat. These are about 40 centimeter across, whereas these are about sort of smaller side plate size, 18, 20 centimeter across. Again, one algorithm, and I can just change, say, the angle where the branching occurs, and you change the angle, and then you start to get different patterns. I can change the weight of the sphere. Well, it's actually a sphere that's moving along, but anyway, change the weight of the branching. The same idea as three-dimensional objects more, this idea of kind of being rootedness. And then the last fractal series that I did, the Mandelbrot urns. Here, in actual fact, the algorithm that I'm using has an R number to it. So the amount that it distorts, I can set up, and it's a viral type replication that is happening here. What intrigues me is how I can take something, I refer to them as found objects, the Mandelbrot mathematical formula. I then redraw it, I change it, a fair amount, but the way it kind of can reference back to those funerary urns that I referenced earlier, the Chinese funerary urns is kind of intriguing to me. This is a detail looking down inside one of those pieces when it's printing. And then a close-up here, how you can see the sort of mathematical formula is dividing the whole time, and it's that sort of fractal nature that we have. So I've gone on a lot about kind of my interest in evolutionary history and evolutionary psychology, and taking that evolutionary approach to art making or creativity. My conclusion would be, as stated here, that all art is applied art. Its application or function is the well-being of humanity. The very fact that art, as I've said, is worldwide. It's been drawn out not only by the practitioners, but by the audience as well. I mean, it's been selected for is because we as a human race are interested in art. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's been a fascinating journey through your practice, and what struck me was the lovely connections made between your obvious respect for humanity and then natural sciences, ecology, the notion of drawing in space, landscape, and then how that is all connected in some way through digital technology. So it's been a fascinating talk. There are a few questions here for you. So the first one I have here is from Tracy, and she asks, what would you say to a student who may be considering using the computer to make their art?
I think obviously, firstly, you need to be very happy with computers, and possibly it's a generational thing as well. That when I was a student, there weren't computers. It's something I've taught myself. I think, as I hopefully have illustrated here, it's enhanced my practice because that's where my interest is. It's not for everybody. If you are interested in computers, I think it's absolutely brilliant way of working. I think computers, are now just part of our life. I'm hoping we're getting to a point that it's not a question as to whether, you know, computers should be in the ceramic department. You know, they're in every other part of life, be it, you know, digital filmmaking or digital music. You know, digital ceramics is an inevitability. You know, there is a big question about, oh, you know, where is the hand and where is the machine and all of that. But, you know, ultimately you just get, you get on and use tools as relevant to yourself.
Thank you, Jonathan. There's another question from Nuala Donovan asking what kind of reception have you had to your work from the ceramic community? What has been the reaction to your work? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as you've probably gathered from my presentation, you know, I'm very nervous about all of this. You know, I'm very comfortable with what I do. It's absolutely right for me. But if anybody is negative, I take that, you know, very personally. So I actually don't show my work a lot, and I guess that's why that very first image, you know, I showed I've worked, I've taken the process out a lot. You know, I'm very happy to teach the process and so on and so forth. You know, and I do like to talk about my work or try and talk about my work. But yeah, yes, people do say, oh, you know, it's not handmade. It's all about the technique, it's all about the technology. And that's a little why for this talk, I didn't want to necessarily talk about that. I wanted to talk about the ideas behind it. And, you know, I hope it is, as I say, it's a tool set. I use it in a very sophisticated, complicated way. But continually, it's ultimately about how it's read, you know, how you see it. You know, and the connection that the viewer has with it. Without putting it out there, I guess I'm not getting that feedback, but I'm too nervous to actually get the feedback, I think, a lot of the time.
There's another question here for you, Jonathan, from Garrett Derland. Have you read any books that have helped you with generating 3D models from found object math formulas? I'm interested in the Perlin and Langton Ant formulas.
That's in some way what I'm doing a lot of the time. I'm not a great reader, although I force myself to read. But you know, so it's in some ways kind of interesting that coding, I won't say becomes more natural. I'm not a great, you know, it doesn't sound possible, but I'm not a great mathematician, and my interest isn't in the heaviness of maths. My interest is in the beauty of the maths and mathematics as an interpretation of the natural world, and how it can give us insights, revelation, you know, into the natural world. And so I'm continually looking, and I think, you know, it's probably quite an obvious process, or my work is very process driven, in that I will, you know, keep fiddling, keep gnawing at something and see what comes out of it. So I will find an algorithm or a, you know, mathematical function, and then fiddle with it, see what comes out to me. And then I hope the fact that it's responding to me will then also respond to a viewer as well. So yeah, you know, I'm continually researching, looking for stuff that I can include in my work. You know, like anyone does. I mean, anyone's studio is often on the walls is images of kind of influence. In my case, the influence is much more abstract. You know, you can't necessarily put a formula on the wall as an image.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Jonathan.
Until it's generated, yeah. Mm.
There's a couple more questions here. I don't know, how are you feeling? Can you take a couple more?
Oh, yeah, I can do. I'm sure I can.
Bombarded. There's one here from Rita Ann Burke that says, fabulous work. Thank you for sharing. How do you decide on the clay to use, and how liquid or not does it have to be?
Yeah, well, reality sets in, you know, that if the clay is too soft, when the machine is sort of building it, it falls down. If it's too hard, it can't get pressed through the machine. So a little over trial and error, you know, I've developed, and this is again, you know, sort of going back to the question about sort of how do the public take it? I think very often, well, I have heard it said, oh, but you just press the button, you know, you must thank the machine for it. And I want to say, oh, I'm not sure I call these things machines as much as instruments. And that might be a bit grand, but the analogy is with a musician who, you know, as I was trying to be a bit blunt early on, talking about the Bach piece of music, that it's transformed through a machine that is, you know, a piano, but we don't treat pianos as machines. You know, we call them instruments because there's that interaction between the artist, the musician, and the machine. So, yeah, I understand my machines that I'm working. I was always very particular that I wanted it in my studio. I don't send my files off to be printed by somebody else. It is part of that process I was talking about. So I've tested a lot of clays. I mean, I started off with porcelain. It's, you know, by pure almost chance, it did work well. I've since found out that, you know, because the clay has been pushed down narrow tubes and, you know, because of pressure on clay, and there's all sorts of scientific stuff, some clays work better than other clays. But I found that, you know, a slightly gritty stoneware clay is my sort of go-to. If I'm doing a workshop, that's what I do. And I mix it up to kind of consistency of toothpaste. With no extra stuff in it. I mean, there's often people who do slip casting, then say, oh, well, should you be adding a bit of deflocculant to it? Because then it'll have less water in it and it will dry better and so on and so forth. No deflocculant. The plasticity of the clay is actually, like it is on the pottery wheel, is you know, the plasticity is what helps make it stand up on the pottery wheel. When you are coil building with a machine, it's the plasticity that helps it stand up as well. So there's, you know, a lot of back and forth between, you know, knowing other techniques as well as this technique.
Jonathan, there's one question that we might like to end on because it speaks of the future. And this is from Georgia Basham, and she asks, where do you see technology within ceramics going in the future? Do you see any technology other than 3D printing?
Well, I don't, you know, what might be coming next, I don't. My answer to this always is I don't do futurology. I can't even pronounce it, you know. I am intrigued how people tend to categorize technology, though, is they sort of see this kind of digital technology as a standalone technology. And I'm just left thinking, you can imagine, you know, 10,000 years ago, someone was coil building their pots. And then there was the invention of the wheel. And then they looked over there and said, but you know, what you're doing with that bit of technology, you know, the wheel as a machine to make your pots with. Aren't you cheating? So it's all of this is just part of the tradition that is a continuum, you know, that I'm reverting back to coil building almost rather than working on the pottery wheel, but the motions that are happening, you know, are very similar to throwing as well, the way it, you know, it goes round and round and round. So how it might go forward from this, I'm not quite sure. Obviously, 3D printing is just another forming method. You know, you can form through molding, you can form through throwing, you can form through coil building or hand building or pinching. You know, it's been added to that. I think, you know, CNC cutting for mold making, you know, has its importance and will become part of, you know, the process that we use. Whether there's another piece of technology, you know, in the future, I'm not sure. I think one thing is, you know, I must point out, and that is that people tend to sort of home in on the 3D printer because that's what one sees. But almost more importantly is all the software that backs it up. I became interested in 3D printing because of what shapes I could make in the software. And so the developments might actually be in the software more than the hardware. You know, I have worked with VR glasses on, and the modeling programs that you get in VR is quite different to working with a mouse and on the screen. So with a VR headset on, you know, the mouse is then in your two hands, and it's a much more physical thing that you're doing, you know, seeing the virtual reality around you when you're shaping the objects. Has much more of a kind of a dance quality to it that is, I guess, you know, might be more, you know, hands-on type ways of working. Yeah, the answer there might be actually in the software as much as the hardware.
Mm. Well, Jonathan, it's been a fascinating talk, and I think we might give you a break now at this stage. But I'd just like to kind of finish by kind of noting how you spoke about, you know, the 3D printer as an instrument. I thought that was a lovely analogy, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in remembering that you also need to learn how to play it, and you know, and then how you play it, you know, is very much down to the individual and the artist's perspective, and what it is that one's trying to do or intends to try and do. But I think you've been extremely modest in terms of, you know, the complexity of the coding and the software, and also actually just the calibration of the machines as well. I have a 3D printer here that you've met before in the background, and we have been using it, but it definitely is something that requires time and dedication and understanding on many levels. So listen, thank you so much for coming to talk to us today, and especially on this unusual format. I think that, you know, having these ways of communicating during these difficult times, you know, have given us all great solace, you know, when we can't really meet face to face. But hopefully in the future we will all meet again, and Jonathan, hopefully you'll come back to Galway again. And so once again, I'd like to thank you and thank everyone involved in Applied Arts Ireland, Applied Arts Northern Ireland, and also the Cross Council of Ireland. So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Jonathan.
Right. Yep. Well, thank you too, and thank you, the audience. Thank you.